There is a name that survives when everything else is forgotten. Empires fall. Borders vanish. Languages shift and disappear into new tongues. But a surname, passed from father to son, carried across steppe and river and war, can outlast all of it. And for millions of people today, one of those surviving names traces back to a population that history books simplified almost beyond recognition. The Cossacks. For centuries, they were painted as a single people. Fierce horsemen. Free warriors of the open steppe. A romantic frontier brotherhood standing between empires. It is a compelling story. It is also, according to the genetic evidence now emerging, only a fragment of something far stranger. Because when researchers began comparing the DNA of families carrying classic Cossack surnames, names like Razin, Bulavin, Nekrasov, Surko, Doroshenko, Platov, Kalnyshevsky, Sagaidakhny, Mazepa, Yermak, Chaplin, Krasnov, and Denisov, the genome did not simply confirm a single frontier bloodline. It revealed something layered, something assembled, a population that was never one people to begin with. This is the story of what DNA found when it went looking for the Cossacks. For most of modern history, the accepted narrative was straightforward. The Cossacks were understood as runaway Slavic peasants and outlaws, Russians and Ukrainians who fled serfdom, fled taxation, fled the reach of the state, and settled the wild borderlands along the Dnieper, the Don, and the Volga. Free men, the story went, forging a new identity out of freedom itself. Democratic assemblies. Elected leaders. A warrior culture built on horseback and river islands. It is a good story. It explains the surnames. It explains the language, which is overwhelmingly Slavic. It explains the Orthodox faith, the customs, the songs. For generations, historians treated Cossack identity as fundamentally an extension of Slavic peasant culture, people who left settled society and built something new on its edges. And on the surface, it holds up. But the surface was never the whole picture. Because almost from the beginning, there were details that did not sit comfortably inside that explanation. Cossack material culture, their weapons, their writing style, their dress, even certain words woven into their dialects, carried unmistakable Turkic and steppe nomadic influence. Names for ranks, for horses, for military organization, borrowed not from Slavic tradition but from the Tatar and Turkic peoples who had ruled the same steppe for centuries before the Cossacks rose. Historians noticed this. They explained it as cultural borrowing, contact, trade, war, proximity. Neighbors absorb each other's customs. That was the assumption. Reasonable, convenient, and largely untested against the deeper archive that no chronicle could access. The genome. Unlike written history, DNA does not care what a population called itself. It does not record political loyalty or religious conversion. It records descent, quietly, mathematically, across generations, in 3 separate lines of evidence. Mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, preserving maternal lineages across thousands of years. The Y chromosome, passed only from father to son, preserving paternal lineage with the same stubborn precision. And autosomal DNA, the vast shared genome inherited from both parents, which can be compared across whole populations to detect mixture, migration, and deep ancestry that no single lineage can reveal alone. When these 3 tools were finally turned toward Cossack populations, the Don Cossacks, the Zaporozhian hosts of the Dnieper, the Kuban and Terek communities of the northern Caucasus frontier, researchers were not simply confirming a Slavic peasant diaspora. They were looking at a genetic mosaic. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where the evidence complicates the map instead of confirming it, consider subscribing, because almost every population we think we understand turns out to be more layered than the textbook version. The first thing the data made clear was this. Cossack populations were not genetically uniform, even among groups that considered themselves the same people. Don Cossacks showed one pattern. Kuban Cossacks, settled generations later along the northern edge of the Caucasus, showed another, carrying detectable signals of contact with Circassian, Nogai, and other Caucasus-adjacent populations. Zaporozhian-descended lines carried yet another signature, shaped by centuries on the middle Dnieper, a crossroads that had already absorbed Slavic, Turkic, and steppe nomadic populations long before any Cossack identity existed. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The word Cossack was never a bloodline. It was a role, a way of life open to whoever could survive it. And the paternal and maternal lines did not always tell the same story. In several sampled communities, Y chromosome lineages, the paternal thread showed a stronger association with classic Eastern Slavic paternal haplogroups. But maternal lineages, in a meaningful subset of individuals, pointed toward older, more localized steppe populations, women whose ancestry predated the arrival of Slavic-speaking settlers on the frontier entirely. This is the kind of asymmetry that reshapes an origin story. It suggests, in outline, a pattern researchers have documented in other frontier and militarized societies. Incoming male settlers, often armed and mobile, forming unions with women from populations already rooted in the land. Not a replacement. A blending, uneven, generational, and largely invisible to written history, because history was written by men recording male lineages, male leaders, male wars. The genome remembered what the chronicles did not think to write down. So the question became more complicated than, were the Cossacks Slavic? The real question was, what populations were already living on the Pontic-Caspian steppe and its river frontiers before Slavic-speaking peasants began arriving in meaningful numbers, and how much of that older world survived, hidden, inside the new one? Here is where three explanatory frameworks emerge, and researchers remain genuinely divided on how much weight each deserves. The first, substantial admixture with Turkic and Tatar steppe populations who had controlled the same territory for centuries under Golden Horde's successor states. This would explain both the cultural borrowings and the maternal line signals, without requiring any single dramatic event, just generations of proximity, intermarriage, and shared frontier life. The second, a ghost population effect, where the DNA is not matching any modern reference group cleanly, because the population that contributed those older signals no longer exists in a form geneticists can directly sample. Steppe peoples who were absorbed, dispersed, or renamed by later history, leaving only fragments in the genomes of their descendants, signals that fit no single modern label because the source population itself dissolved. The third, internal multi-ethnic formation from the very beginning. The idea that Cossack identity was never built on a single migrating people at all, but assembled deliberately from runaway serfs, steppe nomads, prisoners of war, Tatar defectors, and local river populations who together forged a new social category built on freedom rather than descent. Under this model, asking, where did the Cossacks come from, is the wrong question. The better question is, what kind of society could absorb that many different origins and still produce a unified culture, a shared faith, and names that would be passed down for 400 years? Most researchers now lean towards some combination of the second and third. Not a single hidden bloodline. A frontier machine that took in outsiders and produced insiders, and the genome preserved every ingredient that went into it. The landmark evidence came from broader population genomic surveys of Eastern European and Caucasus populations conducted over the past 2 decades, using increasingly dense reference panels that allowed researchers to compare Cossack-descended samples against both modern populations and, where available, ancient DNA recovered from steppe burial sites. These comparisons did something earlier, smaller studies could not. They placed Cossack genomes on a much larger map, spanning thousands of years and multiple population layers, rather than comparing them only to their immediate Slavic and Turkic neighbors. What that wider comparison revealed was the twist. The strongest, most consistent shared ancestry in many Cossack-descended lineages was not simply with the nearest Slavic populations, as the traditional story predicted. Nor was it simply with the nearest Turkic populations, as the cultural borrowing theory alone would suggest. In a meaningful number of samples, the genetic affinity pointed toward older Pontic-Caspian steppe ancestry, a deep layer connected to populations that had occupied this same corridor for thousands of years before either Slavic-speaking or Turkic-speaking peoples arrived in their historically attested forms. Not the group researchers expected. Not even the era they expected. The DNA was not simply recording 400 years of Cossack history. In many lineages, it was preserving traces of a much older steppe world, one that predates the Slavic migrations, predates the Golden Horde, predates almost every group the traditional origin story assumed was the starting point. The genome was not erasing the Slavic peasant story. It was revealing an older frontier beneath it, one that the Cossacks had unknowingly inherited generation after generation without ever knowing its name. This is why the 13 surnames matter. Razin, Bulavin, Nekrasov, Surko, Doroshenko, Platov, Kalnyshevsky, Sagaitakny, Mazepa, Yermak, Chaplin, Krasnov, Denisov, each one is Slavic in form, carried down clean paternal lines through recorded history. But behind each name, in a meaningful share of descendants, sits a genome shaped by populations far older than the surname itself. The name tells you who your father's father's father called himself. The genome tells you something the name was never designed to record. This matters beyond one frontier population. It is part of a pattern researchers keep encountering wherever they look closely at populations once assumed to be ethnically simple. Human migration was never a clean, linear march of pure peoples replacing each other in tidy sequence. It was messier than that. Populations moved, retreated, mixed, separated, absorbed each other, and reformed under new names, new religions, new political loyalties, while the genome quietly kept a more complete record underneath. Identity, as it turns out, is almost always layered. The old maps, the ones that assumed a name meant a bloodline, and a bloodline meant a single origin, were simply too small for what actually happened to human populations across thousands of years of contact. Picture the Dnieper rapids at dawn, mist rising off water that has carried traders, raiders, refugees, and armies for over 2,000 years. Picture the open grass of the Don steppe, where for 1,000 years before any Cossack raised a banner, other riders, Sarmatian, Khazar, Cuman, crossed the same horizon chasing the same rivers and the same survival. The land did not change hands cleanly. It absorbed one population into the next, the way a river absorbs its tributaries without ever losing its name. The people who eventually called themselves Cossacks did not arrive into an empty frontier. They arrived into a landscape already dense with human history, and in seeking freedom, they inherited far more of that history than they knew. That is, perhaps, the deeper truth beneath all 13 surnames, and beneath every name like them. A surname preserves the story a family chose to remember. The genome preserves the story nobody chose to write down. The Cossacks were never simply Slavic peasants who fled to the frontier and reinvented themselves in isolation. They were never simply a Turkic-Slavic blend, as the tidier revision suggested. They were something closer to a living archive. A society built on the edge of empires that absorbed nearly everyone who passed through it, and in doing so, preserved fragments of population history stretching back long before the word Cossack ever existed. The old story was not wrong. It was simply too small for what the evidence eventually revealed. And that may be the truest thing DNA has taught us about every population it has touched, not that our ancestors were less than we imagined, but that they were more connected, more mixed, more ancient, more improbable than any single origin story could hold. If your family carries one of these names, or 100 others like them from that same frontier world, the genome inside you is not just a record of Cossack history. It is a record of everything the steppe absorbed to make that history possible, an inheritance far older and far stranger than any single word could ever contain. The map is still incomplete. It may always be. But every genome tested brings one more fragment of that older world back into view, and somewhere in that widening picture, a name that has survived 400 years is still quietly carrying a story that began long before it.